EverQuest is one of the most successful and influential MMORPGs ever made. It directly influenced World of Warcraft and defined the standards of the genre. It's so interesting of a story that I decided to write an entire book about it, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but for now, I want to get into the weird story of EverQuest's development. There's a lot of twists and turns here, and it starts in an unexpected place, with a game developer losing his job. Welcome to Computer Gaming Yesterday. This is the story of EverQuest.
"1993 was a rough year for John Smedley. He dropped out of college in the late 1980s to found a game development company called Knight Technology. After a few years of porting games between consoles, he sold the company to Park Place Productions, a name you might not recognize, but at the time, it was the largest independent game studio in North America. Some analysts believed Park Place was poised to become the next Electronic Arts or Activision. However, the company abruptly collapsed at the end of 1993 after it found itself without enough cash to cover payroll. As a result, Smedley found himself effectively unemployed. But he didn't just brush off his resume and apply for another job. Instead, he joined forces with his coworkers and marched straight to Sony's game studios in San Diego, which had contracted Park Place for several ESPN sports games. Sony hired them, they joined Sony's ImageSoft studio, and Smedley got the title of producer. It was a masterful move by Smedley. He somehow turned his unexpected unemployment into a management position at one of the world's largest international electronic giants, and he was supervising key games like ESPN Baseball Tonight and NHL Face-Off. To an outsider, it might have seemed the best possible outcome, but Smedley still had a problem. He despised sports games. His passions were in more traditionally nerdy pursuits. A fan of Dungeons & Dragons, he'd tried, and failed, to design a CRPG in his teenage years. After founding Knight Technologies, he worked on Guardian Storms over Doria, an original role-playing game for the Atari Lynx that was meant to support cooperative multiplayer for up to 4 players, but it was canned midway into development. That left Smedley in an odd spot. His career was successful, but he wasn't building the games he'd dreamed of. He liked to play computer RPGs and in more recent years enjoyed online games like Cyberstrike, a multiplayer mech combat simulator. He loved it so much that he racked up $600 in service charges, which was possible in early online games, as they often charged $10 to $20 an hour. So as he settled into his role at Sony, Smedley once again seized the initiative and pushed studio leadership to approve an online role-playing game. The idea didn't go anywhere at first. But then, in early 1996, Sony hired Kelly Flock, a games industry veteran with previous tours at Activision and LucasArts, to head up a rebranded Sony Interactive Studios America. Flock thought an online RPG had potential and approved the game for development, but his approval came with conditions. Flock allocated a budget of only $800,000, which was small even for 1996, and told Smedley to keep his focus on shipping sports titles. Smedley would need to recruit a team of developers to create the game, and given the small budget, preferably developers willing to work for peanuts. Fortunately, he knew a place he could find skilled developers motivated more by passion than money: the online shareware scene.
This is one of my favorite pieces of software, but to tell you the truth, I never bought it. A friend gave it to me after he downloaded it from a bulletin board. It's called the Berg Utilities, written by a man named Vernon Berg. And this is Vernon Berg over here. He's a programmer, but he gives his programs away. Vern, why do you do it?
Well, I give my programs away because I don't need the money, but I like to share what I know with other people, and hopefully then they'll share what they have with me.
In the 1980s and 1990s, before digital storefronts like Steam and GOG, shareware was the go-to way to distribute games for cheap. It was usually posted for free online and accompanied by an address, as in a real-life physical address, where users could mail a few bucks if they liked what they saw. Brad McQuaid and Steve Clover entered the shareware scene in the early 90s. Working under the name Microgenesis, they launched a shareware role-playing game called War Wizard. It's pretty good. The CRPG addict, who reviewed the game in 2022, called it a commercial-quality RPG with brutal tactical combat. But on release in 1993, War Wizard struggled, and the shareware release brought in just $8,000. That wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to let McQuaid and Clover quit their day jobs running IT for a nursery. Undaunted, they dreamed of a bigger, better sequel. The second time around, though, they built and released a demo to gauge interest and perhaps attract a publisher. That demo included McQuaid's contact information. Smedley saw it, gave McQuaid a call, and invited him, along with Clover, in for an interview. The Microgenesis duo went in skeptical. They were looking for a publisher, not an employer, but Smedley won them over with his knowledge of fantasy novels and RPGs, and with his vision of a new type of online computer role-playing game. But perhaps the most alluring part of the pitch was its lack of detail. Smedley would give McQuaid and Clover the freedom to build their own fantasy world from scratch, and that was an offer they couldn't refuse. Both joined Sony Interactive Studios America in 1996 and kicked off development of the game that would become EverQuest. Though he offered creative freedom, Smedley gave one firm directive. He wanted to see a design document that outlined the game's world, characters, and gameplay. McQuaid and Clover were eager to dig in and put together a design document in a few months. The public details of the design document are sparse. I've read accounts that estimate its length between 10 and 80 pages, which seems like quite a range, but I suspect these differences reference different iterations of the document. Smedley, writing in memory of McQuaid after his unexpected death in 2019, said the first document was 10 to 15 pages. I actually contacted Daybreak, the company responsible for EverQuest today, about the document in 2022. According to the company, it's still intact and at Daybreak, but they're not willing to make the document public. As far as I know, it was last seen at an event held at the Comic-Con Museum in 2019. Based on the comments of Smedley and developers I spoke with who worked on EverQuest, however, it seems likely the original document set the stage for all the pillars of EverQuest's world and gameplay. It names the world of Norath, details its origins, and contains references to all the world's original continents, races, and classes, as well as some included in later expansions. From what I've learned, the document probably contained fewer specifics about gameplay, like a full range of all spells for casters or the complete design of levels, but it likely outlined the game's zone-based overworld, called for numerous dungeons, and went into some specifics about the types of spells and abilities that might be available to each class. The document drew heavy inspiration from two sources, Dungeons & Dragons and early multi-user dungeons. Multi-user dungeons, if you've never heard of them, were early persistent online role-playing games that usually relied on a text interface. The first, known simply as Essex Mud or Mud 1, was made available at the University of Essex in 1978. Later, MUDs grew and morphed alongside the internet, and by the 1990s, literally thousands of MUDs were available across the globe. Their growth was thanks to the embrace of open source ideals and their relatively low system requirements. Anyone looking to build a MUD could download one of many available online, customize it, and launch it from a home computer with a network connection. MUDs typically had a scripting language that made it easy to add new items, spells, or quests, and some allowed players to become game masters with powers to edit and add to the world. Players with this coveted ability were often called wizards. Clover and McQuaid liked Sojourn Mud, a game that later forked into Toril Mud. It was based on Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms campaign setting and included many of the races, classes, and locations familiar to players of D&D. Also, unlike many MUDs, Sojourn was both popular and relatively stable. In fact, Toril Mud still exists today and still receives regular updates. I'll leave a link to it in the video description if you want to try the game that most inspired EverQuest for yourself. If you do try Toril, you'll find many similarities with EverQuest. The two games share an alignment system complete with good and evil races, and many of those races, from barbarians to trolls to high elves and dark elves, are found in both. Many classes are similar too. You've got your rogues and warriors, paladins and anti-paladins, shamans and druids, bards and rangers. Both games have death penalties, focus on grinding to reach high levels, and let players set a surname after reaching level 20. EverQuest even lifted the concept and layout of Toril's version of Dungeons & Dragons Waterdeep, which became the iconic city of Freeport. In other cases, the link to Dungeons & Dragons was more direct. Bill Trost and Kevin McPherson were avid fans of D&D, for instance, and in fact the concept and lore behind the game's first expansion, Ruins of Kunark, was taken from a D&D campaign that Kevin McPherson participated in. Many of the characters, monsters, dungeons, and items found in EverQuest are references to characters, non-player characters, or events that occurred in tabletop role-playing games various developers on the team had enjoyed in their youth. Oh, and what about the name EverQuest? Well, stories of its origin differ between sources, but most give credit to Steve Clover. As the stories go, the name struck him either during his newly minted morning commute or in an early design meeting. Either way, the stories agree there was little debate once the name was out there. EverQuest just felt right. With the design document complete, McQuaid and Clover leapt into building the game, and it was obvious they'd need some help. Several team members came to EverQuest because they already knew the duo. Artist Milo Cooper, who had worked on art for War Wizard, was already at Sony when McQuaid and Clover interviewed. He eagerly joined the EverQuest team after finishing work on several ESPN sports titles. Bill Trost and Kevin Burns, artists who contributed to the War Wizard 2 demo, signed on for both art and world building. Roger Uzun, who provided technical advice on War Wizard, joined the EverQuest team as a programmer. Others, like artist Rosie Cosgrove, programmers Kevin McPherson and Vince Herron, and assistant producers Brian Canary, Andrew Seitz, and Matthew Yaney, were initially hired by Sony to work on other projects. However, they gravitated towards EverQuest once they saw what the team was working on. External hires, like Jeffrey Zatkins, often came from MUD communities, where McQuaid was well known for his detailed discussions on MUD design. Other additions included Russ Shanks, who eventually became Chief Operating Officer, and Doc Whiston, who contributed to art and UI design. As the team came together, so did the game, although budget constraints continued to shape development. EverQuest was envisioned as a graphically advanced 3D world, but the team didn't have the time or, frankly, the experience to build a 3D engine from scratch. Thankfully, Sony had an engine lying around. Smedley hadn't just convinced Flock to greenlight EverQuest, he also got approval for an online-only competitive multiplayer tank game Tanarus, which was released for Windows PCs in 1997. It used True 3D, a 3D game engine developed by a small Cincinnati, Ohio-based company called Pyrotechnics. EverQuest was also meant to be a 3D game, and of course, it would also have multiplayer, so the engine seemed a reasonable choice. It arguably became something of a kludge in the end, as the EverQuest team would end up expanding on the engine and rewriting elements of the networking code. But in 1997, as the EverQuest team focused on putting together the first playable prototype, it was good enough. The original EverQuest prototype wasn't anything like what modern players might imagine, but highlights the connection to Tanarus, as well as the game's roots in MUDs, which oftentimes allowed player versus player combat, Sojourn Mud, McQuaid, and Clover's favorite, being no exception. The prototype was essentially a multiplayer deathmatch arena inside a 3D castle with a maze of hallways and hidden traps. It had no quests, no dungeons, and no loot. In concept, it looks a lot like MageStorm, a multiplayer mage combat game released in 1996 by Mythic Entertainment, the studio that would go on to release the MMORPG Dark Age of Camelot. Obviously, the prototype was precisely the opposite of the cooperative players versus monsters experience that EverQuest would become, and to be clear, it was never intended to fulfill the design document's promise. Instead, the prototype nailed down the basics. It proved the team had a functional engine with netcode it could expand on for the full game, and, perhaps more importantly, it was fun. It wasn't as good as Quake or even Tanarus, but the EverQuest team spent at least a few long nights enjoying weird death matches in the prototype level. But that begs the question, if EverQuest's gameplay was influenced by MUDs with player versus player combat, and the game reused engine tech from a competitive multiplayer game, and the first prototype was a deathmatch arena, then how did EverQuest become a game almost entirely focused on cooperative play? Steve Clover shed some light on this in a developer interview for Pantheon, the MMORPG he's currently working on, where he discusses his rather disappointing experience with Ultima Online.
We started playing some UO when it shipped out, Ultima Online. And all of a sudden the screen starts like slowing down. I'm like, oh, this is weird. What's going on? And about 100 guys run on screen and like, yeah, I got completely pwned, right? And I saw that, and I experienced that. And I said, that will not happen in our game.
Basically, Clover got ganked and he wasn't happy about it. McQuaid shared Clover's view. Although most buds did support player versus player combat, McQuaid said on several occasions that he was never a big fan of it, and especially not the free-for-all combat style found in Ultima Online. His argument against PvP was simple but not wrong. Getting beat up by other players sucks, and it makes people quit the game. So McQuaid and Clover decided that EverQuest should focus more on cooperative gameplay, where players team up to fight powerful monsters. But I know what you're thinking, EverQuest did launch with a PvP server, right? So how did that happen? Some credit for that should go to Smedley, who loved competitive multiplayer and thought it should be included. The team apparently went back and forth on this even late into development. McQuaid was even quoted saying EverQuest wouldn't have PvP servers prior to launch. However, some early EverQuest fans demanded a PvP server be made available, and Smedley was still a fan, so McQuaid and Clover conceded and made a few PvP servers available at launch. It was never a focus, though, and of all the well-known MMOs, EverQuest is arguably the least PvP-centric. It shipped with no battlegrounds, no progression, no in-game clans or guilds, and just a few arenas scattered around non-PvP servers. As EverQuest's direction as a primarily cooperative game solidified, the design ideas found in the original document were fleshed out. Brad McQuaid, who, as the team grew, became the game's unofficial creative director, said in a 2011 interview published on MMORPG.com that the developers took a content is king approach. Here again, comparisons to predecessors like Meridian 59 and Ultima Online are relevant. McQuaid felt other online role-playing games were too open-ended and didn't provide enough direction to players. That might be a little hard to understand today, since by the standards of modern games, EverQuest feels almost refreshingly directionless and open-ended, but other games were even more so. Ultima Online had few quests and a skill-based character progression system that lacked major milestones or goals besides maxing out each skill, a process which was mind-numbingly repetitive, and depending on the skill, didn't necessarily make a character much stronger. The skill-based system offered a ton of flexibility and supported that game's famously deep crafting system, but it could make progression feel flat. McQuaid preferred a class-based, level-based system with a maximum level cap for players to aspire to. He also wanted players to have pathways to reaching that level cap that progressed them through the open world. Players would visit new zones and dungeons where they would fight tougher, more intimidating foes. And along this progression, they would become unquestionably more powerful. A level 5 character would hardly stand a chance against a level 10 foe, a level 10 character would be destroyed by a level 15 orc, and so on. These key concepts, constant progression and cooperative play, are hallmarks of EverQuest's design, and those ideas set the game apart. Many modern games now take this very same approach, but back in 1999, no other game played quite like EverQuest.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this documentary on EverQuest, and if you are, I think you'll really enjoy my book on EverQuest, which is now available to buy. Link in the description. Now, most of the information that is in this video is only in the first chapter of this book, so there's a lot of other details here that you're not going to find in this video. One chapter of the book, for example, goes into real money transactions and eBayed items and characters. You know, back in the 1990s, before EverQuest came out, the idea that video game items and characters would have real monetary value to players was viewed as pretty ridiculous, even by game developers. In fact, the developers of EverQuest were completely surprised when they found that players were paying real money on eBay for items and characters from the game. Another chapter in the book goes into the legacy of EverQuest as it stands today, because, you know, EverQuest has not gone away. It is still in active development. It still has tens of thousands of active players. It still gets expansions every year. In addition to that, there is a pretty lively emulated server scene that preserves some of the game's earlier states, so you can go back and enjoy the game as it was on release or as it was in 2001 or 2002. It depends on the server. And this is just yet another way that World of Warcraft has followed in the footsteps of EverQuest, which is another topic I touch on in this book. Anyway, that is it from me for now. Let's get back to the documentary on EverQuest.
In retrospect, of course, we know that EverQuest was a success. But during development, as the team and budget grew and the game blew past launch deadlines, the game began to encounter resistance within the studio, which was rebranded to 989 Studios and was given an even greater focus on supporting Sony's PlayStation game console. Rosie Rappaport has said that colleagues outside the EverQuest team began to jokingly call the game NeverQuest, because obviously it would never ship, and Smedley said the team was often dismissed as the Ghouls and Goblins guys. The friction apparently wasn't universally felt. When I spoke to Trost and Zakins, they couldn't remember feeling left out or hearing about comments made behind the team's back. I'd wager there was probably a mix of opinions within 989 Studios. Still, the opinion of EverQuest within 989 Studios was clearly taking a turn for the worse. The team got some relief from the doubters at E3 1998. Though still a long way from finished, EverQuest was functional enough to demo, and it received huge praise in the gaming press. PC Gaming Magazine wrote favorable blurbs, and the inaugural Game Critics Awards crowned it the show's best multiplayer game. Even better, McQuaid got the chance to show off EverQuest to computer role-playing game legend Richard Garriott, creator of the Ultima franchise, who stopped by the EverQuest booth and liked what he saw. The EverQuest team wasn't in love with some parts of Ultima Online's design, but the Ultima series was a huge influence on McQuaid and Clover's War Wizard, and the commercial success of Ultima Online had provided the EverQuest team with hope their game could sell well, so Garriott's visit was a boost to morale. Around this time, in the June 1998 issue of PC Game Fan, EverQuest received its best preview yet, a full 2-page spread. Like earlier previews, it touched on the features that set the game apart from Ultima Online or Meridian 59. A long list of class and race options, over 40 skills, hundreds of spells, and a lack of PvP combat. But the real focus, in what would become a trend, was EverQuest's graphics. This is the first preview I'm aware of to state hardware 3D acceleration would be mandatory, which was a big deal. It meant most PC gamers would have to buy new hardware to play EverQuest, but also underscored how the game's advanced 3D graphics were in a different league from Ultima Online, an entirely 2D title. Popular role-playing games that attempted a fully 3D world a few years prior, like Meridian 59 and The Elder Scrolls II: Daggerfall, managed to deliver 3D worlds, but had to render characters and objects as 2D sprites. This positive coverage was good news for a team feeling increased internal pressure on all sides, not only from the friction at 989 Studios, but also the intense crunch that was slowly grinding the team to dust. The team still had a ton of grunt work left to do, character models and level models to finish, spells to program and balance, netcode to optimize, and much more. Some team members had brought in sleeping bags to catch a few hours of rest under their desks. At this point, I think it's fair to say the team was tired, but also optimistic. EverQuest was coming together, and with favorable press reception, it looked like the hard work might pay off. But as the days crept towards the end of 1998, opinion on the game among Sony's upper management was headed in the wrong direction. Each extra day was more money spent on a game already past its time, budget, and scope, and the game didn't even fit with 989 Studios' core mission, which was the development of sports titles, and specifically titles to support the PlayStation games console. Smedley did all he could to campaign in favor of the game and insisted that multiplayer games were a genre that Sony would be foolish to ignore, but it was a losing battle. At the end of 1998, EverQuest's luck ran out. Kelly Flock brought Smedley and McQuaid into his office to deliver the bad news. EverQuest was canceled. It would be easy to call the cancellation of EverQuest stupid given how successful the game would become, but I can see why Flock made the decision. Despite all its promise, the game didn't help Flock fulfill his mission to develop sports games that help sell PlayStation game consoles. But Flock still had faith in the game's potential, so he hedged his bets. Instead of immediately halting development and reassigning or firing the entire team, which is standard practice for a canceled game in any era of game development, Flock gave Smedley and McQuaid a lifeline. He told them they had a month to find a new source of funds to finish up EverQuest. If they did, he'd let them spin off the game into a new, independent studio, with Sony getting a stake in it. If they couldn't, that would be the end of it. EverQuest would be dead. Smedley and McQuaid hit the phones, ringing every publisher and investor they thought might be interested. Many were, including Microsoft, which was looking to expand its roster of online games, but not enough to hand over a few $1,000,000. Things were looking grim. But then Smedley and McQuaid found a lifeline close to home from another division within Sony called Sony Online Entertainment. SOE was a division of Sony spun up in the mid-90s that more or less did what it said on the tin. They had a website called The Station that offered some casual games based on game shows like The Wheel of Fortune, as well as a few games targeted at more dedicated players, including Tannerus. Based in New York, the station's operations were separate from 989 Studios and the rest of Sony's PlayStation empire. This division of Sony wanted games specifically for the PC that could only be played online. Finding a lifeline with an entirely different division of Sony was an odd turn of events, but it turned out to be a natural fit. With backing secured, Smedley and McQuaid spun up an independent game studio, Variant Interactive, with investment from two divisions of Sony, both of which were major stakeholders. Aside from a blitz move into new offices, the transition was shockingly seamless. In fact, most of the developers did not know cancellation was ever a serious possibility until years after the game was released. EverQuest's earliest fans started to talk about the game online even before the game's breakthrough moment at E3 1998. An online paper called EverQuest Express popped up in early 1998, followed by EQ Vault. These fan sources started to discuss their hopes for what EverQuest would be and to speculate about when a beta test might appear. Testing began with an exclusive group. The earliest beta testers, who took part in Phase 0.5 and Phase 1 testing, were interviewed over the phone by the EverQuest team and sent a physical disc. Even Phase 2, held in early 1998, was very small, with about 100 testers selected. For early EverQuest fans, a beta invite was like winning the lottery. McQuaid, assisted by Bill Trost, kept up community hype by hosting a series of chats. They were very of the time, taking place in IRC with, as far as I can tell, no moderation. Questions bounced between serious questions about mechanics, like, will the game have fast travel, to half-joking questions about the game's eye candy, like, how big will the female character's breast be? These chats were extremely chaotic and not the kind of thing you would expect a game development team associated with a large development studio to engage in today. But the chats do feel similar to the Discord channels that many modern indie and AA studios use to connect with fans. And it does seem the chats were effective because EverQuest's online community grew rapidly through 1998. EverQuest's beta got serious in the fall of '98. Phase 3 started in November and opened the game up to 4,000 testers. That was a huge leap up from the previous betas, and a promising number. The MUDs that EverQuest was based on often had no more than a few hundred simultaneous players, and EQ was already matching those numbers. Phase 4 arrived in February 1999 and represented the final sprint to launch. With servers now hosted in Variant Interactive's new office, it included an incredible 25,000 players, which, despite the size of this beta, still received discs, plus a letter from Brad McQuaid. This final beta was flanked by an even more intense burst of crunch as the developers rushed to finish levels, or remove those they now knew wouldn't make the game, brush up the network code, refine art assets, and troubleshoot bugs that cropped up daily. And unlike most game development cycles in that era, where going gold allowed some pause or rest, the EverQuest developers worked right up to and through launch day, knowing they could still patch the game client after they shipped. But that's not to say the vision of what EverQuest should be became muddled or uncertain. In fact, while the developers ultimately lacked the time to perfect every aspect of the game, EverQuest's overall vision remained true to the original plan to create what was effectively a 3D MUD, a game with a large world, varying class and character options with well-defined strengths and weaknesses, and a focus towards a group play that encouraged players to chat with each other. Smedley, reflecting on McQuaid's work in a piece posted to the New York Video Game Critics Circle's website, remarked that, quote, EverQuest ended up being 100% what was in that doc. There was no big swerve in the project's course, no major rethink of either theme or execution. The studio kept its talent too. Smedley, McQuaid, Trost, Clover, Burns, Rappaport, Shanks, and Zatkins, and McPherson, among others, saw the project through from its early days. They'd put in an incredible effort in a death march of crunch that, for most developers on the team, would be the worst of their professional careers. But finally, in March of 1999, it was time to put the game that they had spent years of their lives working on in front of the unmerciful gaze of paying customers.
It is rumored amongst the most intelligent races of NORAD that first came the dragons.
EverQuest launched on March 16, 1999, and its sales immediately beat expectations. Over 100,000 copies moved on the first day, and that would increase to 225,000 after 6 months. As a result, EverQuest faced a problem that plagues online games to this day: a rocky launch. Many players couldn't connect at all, and those that did faced random disconnects and excessive lag. The problem, as McQuaid would tell it, wasn't the design or number of Sony's servers, but limitations of the early internet. McQuaid told MMORPG.com, quote, "The millions of tiny packets were too much for routers to handle at that time." In apology, Sony Online Entertainment credited all players with 2 weeks of free game time for their trouble. Smedley has told a similar story in the years since launch, claiming at one point that EverQuest knocked San Diego off the internet for a week. This story, I think, is a bit exaggerated. I've failed to find evidence proving the claim that EverQuest made the internet unavailable for the entire city of San Diego. And given that San Diego is a large city, which at the time had multiple service providers, it doesn't seem plausible. It's more likely, I think, that EverQuest caused problems for the specific service provider it contracted with, UUNet, and that this might have caused problems for other customers at the time. Despite the connectivity issues, EverQuest received plenty of praise. Computer Gaming World called it, quote, "damn addictive and fun." PC Accelerator agreed, giving it a 9 out of 10 and saying, quote, "It came down to a score based on the fact that in the middle of deadline week I stayed up until 3:30 a.m. one night and 5 a.m. the next to keep playing." Next Generation magazine gave it a rare 5-star review saying, quote, "The newest high watermark by which all future persistent online worlds will be judged." There were some critics. Scott Jennings, better known at the time as game blogger Lum the Mad, was among the game's more vocal opponents. A fan of the more open-ended Ultima Online, Scott trashed EverQuest's many restrictions, from the leveling system to the crafting to the lack of open PvP combat. He even complained about restrictions on what players could name their characters. The debate about EverQuest's design choices continued for many years and even became an internal debate at Sony Online Entertainment after it hired some Ultima Online developers to create Star Wars Galaxies. Despite its success, both with critics and at retail, you might be surprised to learn that EverQuest didn't end up on the top seller charts for 1999, or the year after its launch, even if only PC games are considered. It was beat out in raw copies sold by numerous titles, from SimCity 3000 to Age of Empires 2 and Baldur's Gate. EverQuest's system requirements probably had something to do with it. As mentioned, it required a very beefy system to run, including a 3D graphics accelerator. A stable and fast internet connection was a must too, and many people outside major US cities were still using dial-up at the time of the game's release. Also, unlike many modern online games, it didn't launch with any servers for European or Asian players. But that's part of why the success of EverQuest caught the attention of the entire gaming industry. EverQuest wasn't a bestseller, yet it made lots of money for Sony. That's because players who stayed continued paying for months, even years, and that payment went directly to Sony without a cut to a retailer. Put simply, EverQuest made more money from fewer, more loyal players. Publishers were soon falling over themselves to launch their own take on this new business model. The result was a deluge of new MMOs over the next decade, not just EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft, but also Anarchy Online, Dark Age of Camelot, The Lord of the Rings Online, Star Trek Online, City of Heroes, Warhammer Online, Final Fantasy XI, Dungeons & Dragons Online, and many, many others. After a while, even single-player games began to mimic gameplay ideas EverQuest popularized. This trend began with games like Final Fantasy XII and Xenoblade Chronicles, which put open-world design and progression systems inside a single-player story-based game. Though I don't think this trend was fully recognized in the West until the release of games like Kingdoms of Amalur and Dragon Age Inquisition. The entire open-world genre owes a debt to the design of EverQuest, a game that proved the appeal of constant progression, exploration, and advancement in a large virtual world. And while today's mainstream gaming culture has largely moved past EverQuest, as evidenced by the failed attempt to resurrect it with EverQuest Next, it'd be wrong not to acknowledge the ongoing development of both EverQuest and EverQuest 2. Both games still have a loyal player base, and both games receive regular expansions. Or if you want the more old-school experience, you can always check out fan-hosted servers like Project 1999, which largely recreates the experience of the original EverQuest and its first 2 expansions. Here again, I think EverQuest has proved itself a leader, and in fact, I have an entire chapter touching on this in my book on EverQuest, where I speak with several leaders in the emulation community, including Nilbog, the man who started Project 1999. The success of Project 1999 was early proof that MMORPG players would be interested in going back and revisiting the good old days as they grew older. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure we'd see as many legacy MMORPG servers available today if Project 1999 had never happened. Today, many older MMOs have legacy or progression servers that reintroduce the original content, a trend that culminated in Blizzard's decision to launch World of Warcraft Classic. And in fact, one of the developers key to the management of World of Warcraft Classic, Holly Longdale, first worked at Daybreak Games, where she managed EverQuest's time-locked progression servers for several years. You can draw a direct line from Longdale's ideas for progression servers for EverQuest and World of Warcraft Classic's Season of Discovery. Now, before I wrap up here, I want to talk briefly about the memory of Brad McQuaid. He unfortunately passed away at his home in November of 2019. It was an unexpected loss, and I think underscores why it's important to talk about the influential games of the past and to consider why they're important. Kelly Flock also passed several years ago and spoke about EverQuest publicly far less frequently than McQuaid, which means his thoughts on the game's success and the details of why he decided to greenlight the game back in 1996 are also largely lost to time.
You know, the clock is always ticking. The people who make games and the people who play them aren't getting younger. And despite the alleged prominence of digital information, it's actually really easy for this sort of information to be deleted. I'm sure there's chunks of multiple EverQuest forums that are completely gone because they were never backed up by the Internet Archive. And that information is just lost to history forever. It is important to preserve games. It is important to preserve our memories of games. And it is important to preserve the information that come from the developers of those games. Because you know what? This is all only going to exist for so long, and it's very dependent on our current technology. Will we be able to play EverQuest in 100 years? I don't know, but I do know that if we don't think about it and we don't try, we definitely won't be able to. Now, I went pretty deep into the history of EverQuest in this video, and I hope that even players who are very experienced with the game maybe learned a thing or two. But the depth and detail of this video, as I mentioned, is nothing compared to my book, which has a lot more information that you're going to not find here. It just wouldn't be practical to put into the video. And the book is available to buy physically, a link in the description, so you can go grab yourself a copy. It is published by Boss Fight Books, and I hope you'll buy it, enjoy it, and learn even more about this awesome MMORPG. Now, if you finish this video and this is the only thing you've seen from me on EverQuest, also go to my channel and look for some additional videos in the near future explaining a little bit about how to get into the game if you've never played it before. But that's it from me for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.